To the cloud. Okay, hi everybody. This is the Kubernetes SIG Testing weekly meeting. Today is Tuesday, January 8th. I already gave you the spiel about our code of conduct, so please adhere to it. On today's meeting agenda, I'm going to give Patrick about 10 minutes worth of time to talk about a number of PRs he wants to discuss around the end-to-end testing framework, and then I would like to see if we can talk about our evil plans for the V114 time frame. So what do we as a SIG want to try and accomplish this quarter? I put in a milestone in the test info repo that we could use to organize our thoughts there. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand things over to Patrick, who is muted.
Muted, and I was on the wrong screen. I was actually looking at my document and the Zoom window was elsewhere. Okay, so let's get started. 10 minutes isn't that much time, but what I wanted to achieve anyway is just primarily to get some attention towards these open pull requests, because some of the changes touch the end-to-end framework. And for the first one, I thought that it might also be useful to discuss perhaps other use cases for the change that I'm making. So the key change in this first pull request is that I'm delaying the registration of some tests currently in the storage tests until after the command line parameters have been passed. The advantage is that test registration code can check command line parameters, like on which host system am I running, or what's the operating system. Tests that traditionally have been done at runtime can now be done before even adding a test that then can't run later. We have in storage quite a few examples of things that otherwise run for a long time because the test setup before each is slow. But the reviewers in the SIG storage basically tried to get some feedback also on the general approach from SIG testing. And we are still waiting for someone who might have an opinion on that and might give us okay. And we have one open question that we couldn't solve yet, and that is around logging or keeping people informed that some tests are not added to the test suite. Right now, that's completely silent, and depending on expectations, that might actually be the right thing. For example, some of the tests are for the GCE driver that doesn't even run on my local cluster, so I don't care whether that's registered, and I don't want to see skip messages at all. But then it might also be sometimes a bit harder to understand that some tests aren't logged, aren't in the test suite, and that's why we were discussing how to log that information. I try to implement that, but it's currently not really possible in a consistent way because the test code that skips basically an it statement, an it function call, doesn't know the final test name. That information is only available inside Ginkgo, and there's no API at test registration time to retrieve that. So I could try to work with Ginkgo upstream to fix that, but in the short term, that's probably not going to happen.
Kind of confused. Are you saying that we're skipping tests based on their test name and the command line parameters?
No, but if you want to log something, it would be useful to know what the test actually is. And because the skipping happens deep down in a describe context, something, blah, blah, call stack, the code that actually has the if check and knows that it is skipping something doesn't know the context. It doesn't know all the parent names that Ginkgo then concatenates together.
But if you use the actual built-in skip functionality, it should do that.
But the skip functionality, can you call that at init time?
I'm not sure, but like today, a lot of tests use it at runtime. I'm not like...
Yeah, but I think that's... Yeah. I can try.
You're like running the test, and at some point, some code runs that skips it. The difference is the Ginkgo built-in one. Like there is existing behavior today around. Okay, this test was skipped. It's going to show up in the output as skipped.
Yeah, but that's for runtime skipping. That's basically throwing a special. It's basically panicking with a certain error code, I think, and then Ginkgo catches that at runtime. I don't think you can do that at test registration time.
So can you explain the motivation for why you prefer test registration over skipping things at runtime?
The immediate motivation for SIG storage was that we have a test suite that contains tests, and something that happens in a before each is, for example, installing the CSI driver that is needed for the tests. And then with that before each registered in Ginkgo, the tests then get added, and some of them get skipped. And what happens at runtime is that before each driver installation happens, it installs a driver which starts pods and so on. It's kind of slow, and then the test run figure out that they are not even suitable for the current situation, for the current cluster, or for that the test combination of parameters isn't suitable. And then we get to the Ginkgo skip and the test aborts without doing anything, but it's still causing overhead. It's causing output.
So I would contend that this is just a bad test design to restructure the organization of the test itself so that it does the proper checking in the proper order to avoid the lag, right? Versus re-architecting some of the aspects for how skip behaves on a precondition versus a runtime condition.
Can't we just move the initialization that's costly such that that happens lazily, like after we do the skip? I mean, I'm not necessarily a huge
yeah. I'm thinking it's probably possible, but then you basically really have to have another callback that gets executed. I don't know, inside an it. You can't just lazily do the before each.
But couldn't you nest one more describe or context, and then nest the init routine in a before each or something, and skip the parent context as opposed to the inner context?
I mean, I would also
it's
not a great.
You basically have an it statement then would need to call something that when it knows that it needs to run, that it then does the initial the initialization that completely turns around the pattern that normally is used with before each. So I don't think that would work.
Well, we don't necessarily have to use the actual before each either. I mean, before each has its own issues with inconsistent.
So it would be perhaps doable. I'm not a particularly big fan of that approach. I don't think it would make the testing simpler. Let me give another example where I think that skipping tests at init time would be useful. Right now, I know that people get confused when they run a conformance test and they see lots of skipped tests. Or at least that has been the situation a while back. I don't know what's currently happening. And I think there would be value in having a test suite that runs without skipping any tests, so that people, when they look at the test results, see all tests run. I'm fine. And another use case is with what's currently getting discussed around tests that only run on a single node cluster. You could have a command line argument saying, I'm running conformance test for a single node cluster. Only run the tests that are suitable for that situation. And then instead of having to skip tests at runtime, where when someone manually needs to check whether it was okay to skip the tests, you would immediately see that, it would immediately be obvious that this is a complete test run.
Putting it a different way, I don't think it makes sense to do test registration at runtime, because, like, if you do that, then your tests only exist. Like, how am I supposed to know what tests are supposed to exist unless I happen to be on, like, the correct environment that allows those tests to exist? That sounds like very painful to debug and look into.
So there already exists the ability to do the dry run, right? So, like, if you do an expression for Ginkgo, you can get the dry run semantics of what are all the tests should run if I did this regex, right? So it's an A/B comparison. You get the dry run, you say, like, these are all the entire full suite of tests that should be run for a given environment. and then you actually do the run, and the run gives you a different set of results because it had to do a skip list for X, Y, or Z. Because you are running on cloud provider X, you are doing these other things. Now, obviously, conformance should never do that, and conformance shouldn't runtime skip anything. Like there was originally a skip list, but that should have been fixed now for a while.
Right, but I won't be able to do that dry run if the tests don't register themselves.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. The dry run thing doesn't help if a test isn't in the Ginkgo test suite. Okay, well, it sounds like there are concerns about this approach. I'll have to look at whether we can address the immediate need in the SIG storage test suite.
I think if you, so I definitely, I think we hear your call for attention loud and clear. And I think a number of us are interested parties. I personally just don't have the bandwidth to really dig into the repercussions and the details of this, but I agree that I have concerns around the implications for conformance. So if there are people here who could step up and help carry it forward, I would appreciate that. If you can't find those people here, I think other forums for discussion could be architecture or the conformance working group.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll try this. I'll try without delayed test registration. If I can't get it to work sufficiently, I might have to come back or ask for help. But let me try something else first and see how far I get. But let's move on to the next topic, the next pull request, and that is about the the YAML files that are primarily used in SIG storage for things like installing the hostpath CSI driver. The current situation is that someone manually needs to copy those files from somewhere else, and it's not obvious what the upstream URL is, whether the file is really identical. We were trying to replace, or we were considering replacing using local files with downloading via an URL at runtime. But then both I and other people on the SIG storage Slack channel had concerns about more flaky tests and the external dependencies. So what I came up with in this pull request is an approach where the framework itself is given a URL, but there are helper scripts that use that information to populate a local cache, which gets committed together with a URL update. So at runtime, what happens is that the file is indeed used from the local cache, like any other of the manifest files. But then we have an update script under hack that after URL change makes sure that the cache is consistent. And there is a verify script that I intend to add to a brow job, so that only if anything in that directory changes, it will check that the cache is indeed consistent. So that's now looking for a reviewer. I don't have any open issues with that approach. It's really just I need someone from SIG testing to look at that and say whether that makes sense and take that forward.
Okay, seems legit.
So that most of the data for the tests were hermetically sealed enough to be. It gets weird when you're starting to download. The more I'd have to take a look at the exact details of what you're doing and why, but I'm generally concerned with why is SIG storage special cased in these two different scenarios?
Because these YAML files are the files that get released together with the different things that get installed as part of testing. So we do have, for example, the external provisioner, external attacher. These are images that are released by SIG storage as Docker images. And for using those images, you need to have certain ABAC rules installed, for example. And those rules get documented and published in the individual repositories for each of these components.
Why is the test installing these?
Because not all CSI drivers are installed in a normal cluster. You basically have to install the driver before you can use it.
I don't think e2e.test should be responsible for that. I think whatever is doing the setup before we run the test should install the drivers.
I would agree. It's a precondition, not a runtime condition. You're kind of inverting the arguments for the other one.
So I guess a lot of this feels like it is discussion that is centered around the E2E testing framework. And to me, this is begging the question of whether or not the testing commons subproject is a more appropriate forum to steward this discussion, and if we want to pick that thing back up, because I feel like we haven't had that meeting in quite a while, and it's in a slightly more European-friendly time zone.
So Aaron, actually, that's really funny. And Tim, you missed, like you said, you weren't able to attend, but I actually brought up in a VMware call earlier what's effectively testing commons. One of our goals this year is to figure out what the pattern is for these external providers now that I understand things a little bit better, and I've been working with cluster and cloud and our CSI, work on CSI as well. And so I'd be happy to be involved in testing commons and even drive that if you need somebody to make sure that people are aware that it's happening, because yeah, we're encountering this exact same issue. And I agree with Ben and Tim that this is a precondition. And at the same time, you will also need to then test those drivers, which it's not a precondition if you're testing the drivers themselves. We have these different levels of testing.
Largely what I'm hearing from Patrick are requests for help from people who have sufficient experience with the framework and historical knowledge of the project to understand where all the bodies are buried. Okay. And I feel like Ben is relatively occupied with Kind. It's not something he can provide full-time. I'm pretty locked up with the 1.14 release. It's not something I can dedicate full-time. I know Tim St. Clair has capital O opinions on all of this stuff, but what I feel like is needed to help out Patrick and just the project as a whole is like somebody who's willing to shepherd all of this stuff and bird dog it.
A bunch of people, not just one person.
Right. I agree. A bunch of people need to actually make it happen, but there needs to be some collaboration and consensus. So to me, testing commons seems like the right form. And I'm raising it just because selfishly, like our agenda, my plan was to talk about V114, and I don't really see a lot of time for a big, long-winded discussion on that. And I think Patrick raises very valid points that, Andrew, you're right, this problem will only grow in complexity as we look to separate out cloud providers, and the configuration for a cluster under test increases in complexity, doesn't decrease. So like finding the right patterns to make it easier for everybody to copy, paste, and rubber stamp tests out would be helpful. I just don't know if this is the right forum to figure that out.
Yeah, well, if someone can point out how to get those driver installations into some pre-cluster setup thing, that would be appreciated. Right now, I just don't know how that could be done. And in the meantime, we have to deal with these YAML files somehow. So it would be good to know whether there is a long-term plan or whether we take this as a short-term solution, or
where would registration of drivers of that nature fall from a kubeADM perspective?
Yeah, but what if a cluster isn't brought up with kubeADM? For example, I'm testing with a local up cluster that's brought up with HAG local up.
Yeah, I mean, so for all of those, I would expect you have some tool, like so for a bunch of our CIQ tests, that is calling the cluster up and some other things, and then the test, or whatever you're using to orchestrate Sonabuoy or run kubeADM, and at that point you would install it would be like an add-on. And I wouldn't expect e2e.test to install that. I'd expect whatever was calling e2e.test to do that.
So we talk about kubetest as being sort of our standardized workflow for standing up a cluster and then running tests against it and then getting all of the appropriate artifacts. It seems like what we're missing in that standardized test lifecycle is after you've stood up the cluster, you then configure it with a bunch of stuff, and then you run the tests. And I think that previously Sen had talked at one of these meetings about trying to redesign kubetest because we feel like it's gotten a bit clunky, and maybe that's the right place to talk about if we need to standardize the pattern of like what's the right boundary for these things?
Yeah, except I wouldn't categorize it as a bunch of stuff, because that sort of diminishes what it is. It's really key components of Kubernetes that have been externalized.
I'm saying a bunch of stuff to be really vague, because it could be anything from add-ons to CSI drivers to CNI drivers to setting up a specific set of RBAC rules to harden the cluster. So just some kind of pre-test configuration phase, right?
Yeah, but then you also have to have some feedback loop between I'm intending to run these tests, and these tests need this setup, and the cluster setup then needs to know basically, yeah, what kind of setup is needed for the tests that are intended to be running. It might not be a full test, for example. And likewise, the tests then need to be able to check that the setup has been done. Well, they might be able to observe that, so that might be covered.
I mean, why? I mean, tests don't check that like a cluster exists. They just try to talk to it, and then that works or it doesn't.
Yeah, but then say I want to test the host path driver. That means that I need to select a certain setup step for the host path driver, and then select the tests that depend on that. So I need to get both right if I want to run that particular test.
Right, so the thing that is running the tests can do that, though. It can say, I want to run the host path tests, and I can say, I'm going to install this. I mean, imagine for like the end user workflow, if they want to test their cluster, I would not expect as an end user that if you're testing some drivers that you also went and installed those drivers as part of the test.
Yeah,
with 5 minutes remaining,
I guess it depends. It's not just that I want to test one host path driver. I want to test a certain version, for example.
Patrick, I'd like to talk with you more about this. This is exactly what we're doing at VMware, and I understand what you're saying, right? It's a test matrix. It's no longer just a two-dimensional graph. With external providers, we've introduced a new access, and it's just a bevy of new points of test. And like Aaron, you said like a precondition or like a pre-test, and I would almost even say, but it could also be considered a post-cluster, because these now are part of the cluster, right? It's part of what we're trying to test conformance, and so if it's part of the thing we're testing that's conformant, then it's not something we're setting up pre-test. It's actually part of the cluster we're deploying, because we're verifying that these bits that we deploy are conformant.
Right. That's all fair. And just to be clear, the reason I mentioned kubeadm was because I think kubeadm has tried to be very explicit in defining a linear set of phases that get you to standing up a cluster. And I'm trying to think of this in that mindset, like what's the next linear set of steps, and where do those end before we start kicking off tests. So just some administrative, since we're going to lose our room in now 4 minutes. This sounds like it merits enough to talk in a separate forum. I'm totally happy to host a breakout discussion on this Zoom, or the Testing Commons meeting might be a more appropriate place. I feel like Patrick and Andrew, could you guys start a discussion on the mailing list to figure out what makes the most sense for folks? Second, I would like to actually have a discussion about our planned V114 work, so I'm going to kick that to next week and try and keep next week open for that. If you do have things you think this SIG should be focusing on, or you are planning to work on behalf of this SIG, please apply the 114 milestone to those issues. I'm going through and scrubbing all the things this week. Tim, you look like you had something to, Tim St. Clair, you look like you had something to say.
I'm just poking them on Slack right now in the separate channel, so we can try to rally there, and I'll loop in Hannes and the other folks too that wanted to reconvene on this topic as well.
Okay, and then one last, with the 3 minutes we have left, I'm going to hand it over to Feda because he loves throwing controversial stuff out here. He wanted to tell us about his idea to use Go modules within test infra. To pilot that to see how well Go modules work out for this project.
Yeah, so we have a bunch of automation to update dependencies with the hack update deps and update Bazel, and there's some support. Essentially, Bazel will also support Go modules, and so I would like to, assuming that we get all of the same automation working with Go modules, I would like to switch over the test infra repo to be using the Go modules rather than dep. And yeah.
I put a
be careful
comment
about breaking Qt test installs. I believe Go modules has some different behavior around things like Go Git. The other thing that I would really look out for, which is why I haven't switched any projects yet, is that Go modules doesn't use vendor. I think you can vendor, but it won't read it. So for like test, so we will probably need to run a module cache like Athens, and we might want to start looking into that.
Hey guys, I put a comment.
Oh, sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I when I saw this on the agenda, I actually put a comment about 20 minutes ago on this because I was concerned that, like, I think this is a good idea, but there are still, at least to my knowledge, pending Python scripts. So for example, like the S3 work, or the I forgot what it was. It was when it gets the bits, and I was going to enhance it for S3, but they're like, oh, it's Python, but we don't want to do new Python work, so we want to convert it to Go. Has that been converted yet? I mean, if we're doing Go work, is this going to be part of that, or are we just?
I think this isn't an attempt to, any of the stuff that's in JavaScript or Python or Bash, this is not an attempt to change that to anything else. This is purely just to, like, when Go code imports a library, how we determine where to import that. Right now,
I understand that.
And I want to start using Go modules, and so anything that's in Python would remain in Python.
No, but this was at least this particular thing was a special case. You have a Go program for it, but you haven't started using it yet. And I'm saying if there's outstanding Go work that you want to, maybe we could take this offline. Yeah, I'm familiar with Go modules. I have strong feelings on them because I'm friends with Sam Boyer, and yeah. But I think they're interesting. But in this particular case, there was a Go program that you wanted to start using to get bits off of the buckets, but you were using Python and you hadn't converted to the Go program yet. And when I raised the topic of enhancing the Go program, you said, well, we're not using it yet. And then you had no timeline for migrating from Python to Go, even though there was a Go program for it.
It's the test grid scraper that currently lives
Thank you. I couldn't remember what it was for.
You wrote, but we're not actually using to scrape things out of GCS and send them over to test grid live.
Right.
So anyway, yeah, we should take this offline. Please never use the words bash and vendor again. Things like that scare me. Bash shouldn't have dependencies like that.
What if you just want to hit a vendor? You can bash them.
Okay. Exceptions can be made. Thank you, everybody, for your time. I think something else I'll ask the mailing list is if we feel like meetings get super compressed like this, whether or not we're comfortable extending them out to an hour as needed. This is a question that comes up about once a year, and we tend to have ebb and flow. So I'll pull the mailing list and see what you all think. With that, I bid you all a happy Tuesday and farewell and a happy new year. And it's great to see all your faces again. Yay, 2019. Bye.